Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. The lighthouse at Widow's Point. The sea was angry that night. It always is in my memories. 23 years I'd spent as keeper of the Widow's Point lighthouse, and still I'd never seen the Atlantic so restless. The waves crashed against the rocky shore like they were trying to pull the whole damn tower into the deep. Maybe they should have. My name is Thomas Blackwood. I've been the lighthouse keeper at Widow's Point since 1974, when I took over from old Jeremiah Thorne. Back then, the coastal authority still believed in human keepers, though most lighthouses had already gone automated. Widow's Point was different. The equipment kept failing here, they said, needed a human touch. Now I understand why. That night, November 12, 1997, I was making my evening rounds. The wind howled through every crack in the stone tower, 150 years old and showing every bit of its age. My routine never varied. Check the light, check the radio, check the logbook, check the weather instruments. Predictability was my comfort in this isolated post. I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, my legs knowing each of the 103 steps by heart. The massive Fresnel lens rotated steadily, sending its beam out across 20 miles of open water. The mechanism hummed its familiar song, a sound that had lulled me to sleep more nights than I could count. The radio crackled with static as I made my hourly check-in. Widow's Point to Coastal Authority, evening status report, all systems normal, weather deteriorating, over. The response came through layers of atmospheric interference. Coastal Authority to Widow's Point, acknowledged, storm warning in effect until 600 hours, maintain vigilance, over. Understood, Widow's Point out. I made a note in the logbook, then moved to the weather instruments. Barometric pressure falling rapidly, wind speed 40 knots and rising, temperature dropping, classic nor'easter brewing. I'd weathered dozens in my time here, and this one didn't worry me particularly. The lighthouse had stood for a century and a half. It would stand through this. As I turned to descend the stairs, something caught my eye through the rain-streaked glass. A light on the horizon, a ship's light where no ship should be. The shipping lanes ran well clear of Widow's Point. The underwater reef formations made these waters treacherous, which was precisely why the lighthouse had been built here in 1847. In all my years, I'd rarely seen vessels this close, especially not in weather like this. I grabbed the binoculars from their hook and trained them on the distant light. Through the driving rain, I could just make out the silhouette of what appeared to be an old sailing vessel. Not a modern ship at all, but something from another century. A three-masted schooner, if I wasn't mistaken. Impossible, I muttered. I reached for the radio again. Widow's Point to Coastal Authority. I'm tracking an unidentified vessel approximately 2 miles offshore, heading toward the reef. Over, the radio hissed and popped, no response. Widow's Point to Coastal Authority. Do you copy? Over, nothing but static. I tried the emergency channel, same result. The storm must have been interfering with communications. I'd have to handle this myself. I adjusted the binoculars again, but the ship was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. I scanned the horizon methodically, sector by sector. Nothing. Either it had changed course drastically or I was seeing things. It wouldn't be the first time loneliness had played tricks on a lighthouse keeper's mind. There were stories about Widow's Point, stories I'd dismissed as superstition and folklore. Old Jeremiah had tried to warn me when I took over, his roomy eyes serious beneath bushy white brows. The sea gives up its dead at Widow's Point, he'd said, and sometimes they come calling. I'd laughed it off then. 23 years later, I wasn't laughing anymore. I made one final check of the light, then descended the stairs to my living quarters. The keeper's house was attached to the base of the tower, a sturdy stone building with thick walls that kept out most of the cold and damp. I stoked the fire in the wood stove, put on a kettle for tea, and tried to shake the unease that had settled over me. The wind moaned through the eaves, a sound so familiar I usually didn't even notice it. Tonight, though, it seemed to carry voices, whispers, names. I shook my head. Get a grip, Thomas, I muttered to myself. It's just the storm, the kettle whistled. I made my tea and settled into my armchair with the dog-eared copy of Melville I'd been working through for the third time. The familiar words should have been comforting, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, watching the rain lash against the glass. That's when I heard it, a knocking at the door. I froze, teacup halfway to my lips. No one should be out there. No one could be out there. The nearest town was 5 miles away, and no sane person would travel the cliff path in this weather. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I set down my cup and rose slowly. The lighthouse service revolver was in the drawer of my desk. I'd never had cause to use it, but I took it out now, checking that it was loaded. Who's there? I called, approaching the door cautiously. No answer, just another series of knocks. Steady, deliberate, I steeled myself and opened the door a crack, revolver ready. Nothing, no one, just the howling wind and driving rain. I stepped outside, the revolver held before me, and looked around. The beam from the lighthouse cut through the darkness overhead, illuminating the area in rhythmic sweeps. Each time the light passed, I caught glimpses of the rocky ground, the path leading up from the cliff edge, the small shed where I kept tools and supplies. Nothing out of place, no sign of visitors. I was about to go back inside when the light swept across something that made me freeze. Footprints in the muddy ground, not coming from the path but from the direction of the sea. They led directly to my door. I followed them backward with my eyes. They disappeared over the edge of the cliff. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the chill. I hurried back inside, bolted the door, and leaned against it, heart pounding. The radio, I needed to contact the coastal authority, tell them. What, that I was hearing knocks with no knocker, seeing footprints that came from the sea. I rushed to the radio set in my quarters. Widow's Point to coastal authority. Emergency over, static hissed back at me. Widow's Point to any station receiving. This is an emergency, over, nothing. I was alone with whatever was happening. I returned to the window, peering out into the storm. The lighthouse beam swept across the grounds again, and I saw something that turned my blood to ice. A figure stood at the cliff edge. A man in what appeared to be old-fashioned sailor's garb, his clothing and hair dripping wet. As the light passed over him, he turned toward the lighthouse. His face was pale as death, his eyes black holes in his head. Then the light moved on, and when it returned, he was gone. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't happening, couldn't be happening. I was a rational man, always had been. There had to be an explanation. The storm, the isolation. My mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to breathe deeply, to think logically. If there was someone out there, a real flesh and blood someone, they might need help. Perhaps a boat had wrecked on the reef. It had happened before, though rarely since the advent of modern navigation equipment. I had a duty as lighthouse keeper. I couldn't cower inside because of what might have been a trick of the light or my imagination. I put on my foul-weather gear, thick rubber coat, pants, and boots, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and made sure the revolver was secure in my pocket. Then I stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet as soon as I cleared the doorway. Rain lashed at my face like needles. I switched on the flashlight and swept its beam across the grounds. "Hello," I shouted, my voice whipped away by the gale. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" I moved cautiously toward the cliff edge where I'd seen the figure. The ground was slick beneath my boots, and I had to fight for every step. The flashlight beam bounced across the rocky terrain, catching nothing but rain and stone, until it did. A glint of metal caught the light, something half buried in the mud near the cliff edge. I approached carefully and crouched down. It was a ship's bell. Ancient by the look of it, encrusted with barnacles and corrosion. It shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there. I'd walked this ground every day for 23 years and had never seen it before. I reached out to touch it, then hesitated. Something told me not to, something primal and afraid, but I was a man of science and reason. I grasped the bell and pulled it from the mud. It came free with a sickening squelch, heavier than it looked. The metal was cold against my gloved hands, colder than it should have been even in this weather. As I turned it over, I could just make out an inscription beneath the marine growth. Elizabeth Dane, 1871. The name meant nothing to me, but the date sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the storm. 1871. The bell was over 125 years old. As I held it, a sound began to rise above the howl of the wind, a tolling. The bell was ringing, though I wasn't moving it. The sound grew louder, deeper, filling my head until I thought my skull would crack. I dropped the bell, but the tolling continued. 7 times it rang, then silence. 7 bells. In a sailor's watch, 7 bells marked 3:30 in the morning, but my watch showed just past midnight. I scrambled to my feet, suddenly desperate to be back inside the lighthouse. As I turned, the beam of my flashlight caught something in the water below the cliff. A ship, the same 3-masted schooner I'd seen earlier, now much closer to shore. Too close, dangerously close to the reef, and it was impossible. The vessel was ancient, its design a century out of date. Even as I watched, it turned broadside to the waves, a fatal mistake in these waters. No modern captain would make such an error. I should have run then, should have locked myself in the lighthouse and radioed for help until someone answered. Instead, I did something I still can't explain. I went down to the shore. There's a narrow path cut into the cliff face, used for bringing up supplies when sea delivery is the only option. It's treacherous in good weather, suicidal in a storm. Yet I found myself descending it, one careful step at a time, the flashlight beam showing me where to place my feet. The tolling of the phantom bell seemed to guide me, though I'd left the physical object on the ground above. 7 bells. Over and over, 7 bells. I reached the small, rocky beach at the base of the cliff. Waves crashed just feet away, threatening to sweep me out to sea with each surge. The beam of my flashlight played across the churning water, searching for the ship. It was gone, again, as if it had never been there, but something else was. As the waves receded, they left behind objects on the shore, debris, wreckage. I moved closer, playing my light across the items. A ship's log, its pages waterlogged and illegible. A compass, its needle spinning wildly. A sextant broken and twisted. And bodies, dear God, the bodies. They lay half buried in the sand and rocks, at least a dozen of them. Men in the clothing of another century, their flesh bloated and pale, their eyes open and watching me. I stumbled backward, a scream locked in my throat. This wasn't possible. These bodies should have been skeletons after so long in the water, not perfectly preserved corpses with eyes that tracked my movement. As I watched in horror, one of them moved, a hand twitched, an arm raised. Slowly, terribly, the figure began to rise from the sand, then another, and another. I turned and ran for the cliff path, my feet slipping on the wet rocks. Behind me I heard the squelch of waterlogged boots on sand. The rasping of breath that should not exist from lungs long since filled with seawater. I scrambled up the path, not daring to look back. The wind tore at me, trying to pry me from the cliff face and cast me down to the things below. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I climbed, showing me glimpses of the path ahead, the churning sea below, the dark figures following me up from the shore. Somehow I reached the top. I staggered across the grounds toward the lighthouse, my sanctuary. Behind me, hands emerged over the cliff edge. Pale, bloated hands clutching at rock and earth, pulling their owners upward. I reached the door and fumbled with the latch, my fingers numb with cold and terror. The door swung open and I fell inside, kicking it closed behind me. I shot the bolt home just as something heavy thudded against the other side. Knocking. The same steady, deliberate knocking I'd heard earlier. I backed away from the door, the revolver now in my shaking hand. The knocking continued, moving from the door to the windows, all around the house as if surrounded. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly fired the gun. Through waves of static, a voice emerged, not the coastal authority, but something else, something wrong. 7 bells, it rasped, time to relieve the watchkeeper. I stumbled to the radio. "Who is this? Identify yourself." "We are the crew of the Elizabeth Dane," the voice replied. "Wrecked upon your reef in the year of our Lord 1871, through the negligence of your predecessor who let the light go dark." "That's impossible," I said. "That was over 100 years ago. The sea holds its grudges, keeper." "The sea does not forget." The voice changed, becoming several voices speaking in unison. "And neither do we." The knocking intensified, becoming a pounding. The windows rattled in their frames. The wind outside seemed to form words now, calling my name. I backed away from the radio, which continued to emit the terrible voices even though I hadn't pressed the transmit button. They were chanting now a sailor's work song from another century. I had to get to the lantern room, had to make sure the light stayed on. Whatever was happening, I still had my duty. I rushed to the door leading to the tower stairs. As I pulled it open, I came face to face with a drowned man. He stood on the bottom step, water cascading from his clothing and hair, pooling around his feet. His skin was the color of a fish's belly, his eyes milky and dead. Behind him on the stairs stood more figures, all in the same condition, the crew of the Elizabeth Dane. I slammed the door and backed away. There was no escape. They were outside the house, and now they were inside the tower. I was trapped. The pounding at the windows intensified. Cracks began to appear in the glass. The temperature in the room plummeted until I could see my breath misting in the air. The radio voices grew louder, more insistent. "The light goes dark tonight, keeper." As it did for us, I looked up at the ceiling, toward where the great Fresnel lens rotated above. The beam still swept across the sea, but for how long? If they reached the lantern room, I couldn't let that happen. Whatever these things were, whatever they wanted, I couldn't fail in my duty. Not while I still drew breath. I checked the revolver, 6 shots. It wouldn't be enough against so many, but it might buy me time. Time to reach the lantern room. Time to ensure the light stayed on. The first window shattered inward, glass exploding across the room. A pale hand reached through the opening, followed by an arm, a shoulder. I raised the revolver and fired. The bullet passed through the figure as if it were made of mist. It kept coming, pulling itself through the window with terrible purpose. I fired again and again. No effect. More windows broke. More drowned sailors began to enter. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the walls and furniture. I was out of options. I ran for the tower door, yanked it open. The stairway was still filled with the dead crew, but they moved slowly, ponderously. I might be able to push past them to reach the lantern room before they could stop me. I took a deep breath and charged forward, shouldering the first figure aside. It was like plunging into ice water. The cold of its form penetrated my clothing, chilled me to the bone. But I pushed through, and then I was on the stairs, running upward. Behind me, the drowned sailors began to climb, their waterlogged boots making sickening squelching sounds on the stone steps. Up I went around and around the spiral staircase. 90 steps, 95. The dead crew followed, inexorable, unhurried. They didn't need to rush. They had all eternity. 100 steps, 103. I burst into the lantern room, slamming the door behind me and wedging a chair under the handle. It wouldn't hold them for long, but I needed time. The great lens continued its rotation, the light sweeping out across the tempestuous sea. Everything seemed normal here, untouched by the horror below. I moved to the radio equipment kept in the lantern room for emergencies. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Widow's Point Lighthouse. We are under attack. Repeat, we are under attack. Nothing but static. The door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it from the other side. The chair legs scraped a few inches across the floor. Another impact. The chair shifted further. I looked desperately around the room for anything I could use as a weapon, though I knew conventional weapons were useless against these things. My eyes fell on the logbook, records of the lighthouse going back decades, including perhaps to 1871. I lunged for it, flipping back through the pages, past my own entries, past Jeremiah's, past keepers whose names I'd never known. Back and back, the handwriting changing, the ink fading, until I reached 1871. The door splintered. Pale hands reached through the gaps. I scanned the entries frantically. November 1871, a storm much like tonight's. The keeper, a man named Ephraim Blackwood, my ancestor, wrote of a ship in distress, the Elizabeth Dane. The last entry, dated November 12, 1871, read, "Light failed at midnight, mechanism seized, worked through the night to repair. Dawn revealed wreckage on the reef, no survivors, God forgive me." November 12, the same date as tonight, 126 years later, the door gave way. The drowned crew of the Elizabeth Dane poured into the lantern room, their dead eyes fixed on me. Their captain stepped forward, seawater dripping from his beard, his uniform rotted but still showing the insignia of his rank. "The light failed," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. "We depended on your beacon and it failed us." "That wasn't me," I said, backing away until I hit the glass wall of the lantern room. "That was Ephraim Blackwood, not me." "Blood calls to blood," the captain said. "The debt passes to you. The light goes dark tonight and another ship will join us in the deep. The cycle continues." As if on cue, the light mechanism above me made a grinding noise. The rotation slowed, the beam dimmed. "No," I lunged for the mechanism, but dead hands grabbed me, held me back. Their touch was like being submerged in the winter Atlantic, the cold so intense it burned. Through the glass out at sea I saw a light, a ship's light approaching the treacherous waters near the reef. "Please," I begged, "those are innocent people." "They've done nothing to you. We were innocent," the captain said. "We did nothing to deserve our fate. The sea does not care about innocence, keeper, neither do we." The light gave one final, feeble sweep, then went dark. The lantern room was plunged into blackness, illuminated only by the spectral glow of the drowned crew. In the distance I heard a ship's horn, long and low, searching for the lighthouse beacon that should be guiding it to safety. "You can't do this," I said, struggling against the cold hands that held me. "I won't let you." The captain's face loomed close to mine, his dead eyes inches from my living ones. "You have no choice, keeper. The debt must be paid. Blood for blood, ship for ship, soul for soul." He reached into his rotted uniform and withdrew a knife, its blade green with corrosion. "Your predecessor took his own life after our wreck. Threw himself from the top of this tower onto the rocks below. His blood paid for his failure, but not for ours, not for our lives." The knife pressed against my throat, cold as the grave. "Wait," I gasped, "there must be another way. Tell me what you want, tell me how to end this." The captain paused, the knife still at my throat. "The light," he said. "Restore the light, guide the ship to safety. Then take your predecessor's place among us, a keeper for a captain. A fair exchange, a sacrifice, my life for the lives on that ship. How do I know you'll keep your word?" I asked. "We are bound by the laws of the sea and the dead," the captain said. "We cannot break our oath." I looked past him, through the glass walls of the lantern room to where the ship's lights were drawing ever closer to the reef. Minutes, perhaps, before disaster. "Release me," I said. "Let me fix the light." The cold hands fell away. I staggered to the mechanism, examining it quickly. The power was still on, the electrical components were functioning, but the rotation mechanism had seized just as it had in 1871. Different technology, same failure. I grabbed the manual crank built for just such emergencies and began to turn it. The massive lens groaned, then slowly began to rotate again. The light flickered, then blazed to life, sending its beam out across the dark waters. I kept cranking, my arms burning with the effort. The lens picked up speed, the beam strengthening. I watched as the ship in the distance changed course, turning away from the reef, back towards safer waters. Behind me, the captain spoke. "You have fulfilled the first part of our bargain, keeper. Now for the second." I turned to face him, still holding the crank to keep the light moving. "And if I refuse, then we take you anyway," he said simply, "and we return year after year to claim more souls. The debt must be paid." I looked at the drowned crew, their faces showing nothing but the patient malevolence of the long dead. Then I looked out at the ship, now safely past the reef, its lights receding toward the horizon. I need to record what happened, I said, in the logbook so the next keeper will know. The captain nodded. Make your final entry, keeper, then join us. I released the crank. The mechanism was working smoothly now and moved to the logbook. With shaking hands I wrote, November 12, 1997. Light failed at midnight, manually restored. Encountered the crew of the Elizabeth Dane, wrecked on this date in 1871. They demand payment for the failure of my predecessor. I go to join them willingly to end the cycle. To whoever reads this, on this night each year, ensure the light does not fail. The dead are waiting. I signed my name, closed the book, and turned to the captain. I'm ready. He gestured toward the outer gallery, the narrow walkway that circled the lantern room on the outside. I opened the door and stepped out into the howling wind. The storm had intensified, the rain lashing horizontally. Far below, the waves crashed against the rocks. The drowned crew followed, surrounding me. The captain stood beside me at the railing. Blood calls to blood, he said. The sea awaits. I closed my eyes, thinking of the ship I'd saved, the lives that would continue because of my sacrifice. I thought of Jeremiah's warning, which I'd ignored. I thought of Ephraim Blackwood, my ancestor, who had faced this same choice and taken his own life rather than join the crew. I wouldn't make his mistake. His suicide had only prolonged the cycle, ensured the Elizabeth Dane's crew would return year after year, claiming more victims. The sea gives up its dead at Widow's Point, I whispered, echoing Jeremiah's words. And sometimes they come calling. I opened my eyes, looked at the captain one last time, and stepped over the railing. The fall was both eternal and instantaneous. The cold embrace of the Atlantic closed over me, dragging me down into darkness. The last thing I saw was the beam of the lighthouse sweeping overhead, guiding ships safely past the place where I had died. But death was not the end, not at Widow's Point. I stand now with the crew of the Elizabeth Dane, watching as a new keeper takes up residence in the lighthouse. The Coastal Authority investigated my disappearance, found my final log entry, dismissed it as the ravings of a man who committed suicide. They've automated the lighthouse now. No more human keepers, just machines that can fail. And when they do, when the light goes dark on November 12th, we will be waiting, all of us. The crew of the Elizabeth Dane and Thomas Blackwood, the last keeper of Widow's Point Lighthouse. The sea does not forget, neither do we.